Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session from the Alumni Festival here in Cambridge. My name's James Warren. I'm Professor of Ancient Philosophy in the Faculty of Classics, and I'm currently chair of the faculty board. We're about to begin a really interesting year in Cambridge Classics, in part marking 3 significant anniversaries. The first, which is perhaps the less interesting one for this afternoon, is 2022 marks 200 years since the beginning of the first fully organised classics tripos. Students began to study for a classics tripos here in Cambridge. Classics had been taught before then, of course, but the tripos really got going 200 years ago. More recently, and the subject of what we're going to hear about this afternoon, we're now 50 years since the faculty decided to inaugurate a course to teach Greek to undergraduates who hadn't been able to study up to A-level Greek or the equivalent at school. So these were people with A-level Latin or equivalent but had no Greek, including one of our guests this afternoon, my colleague Paul, who was one of the first cohorts of students to go through that program. I also went through it, not 50 years ago, but not that recently either. But you'll hear a bit more about the decisions that went into forming that option and the current state of our teaching Greek to people who haven't done it at school, and looking ahead to the future of what we'll be doing in years to come. But we also are marking 20 years since perhaps a more radical move, which was to open up the classics tripos to students who'd studied neither Latin nor Greek at school. Up until then, you had to at least have done Latin until you were 18. But from 20 years ago, we began admitting students who'd done neither Greek nor Latin for the classics course, and they take what we call a 4-year course. They do an additional year at the beginning of the 3 years, and we'll hear a bit more about that as well. So without further ado, let me hand over to the 2 colleagues who are going to take you through most of the proceedings. So these are 2 of the colleagues who are absolutely at the forefront of that language teaching. So Mr. Franco Basso and Rosanna Omitowoju, and I think Franco is going to start.
Thank you, James. So as we heard, the teaching of Greek in the Cambridge Faculty of Classics to students who have not studied it before, or not to A-level standards at least, or equivalent, as we typically add when we write formally about these matters, has been a defining feature of the classics teaching at Cambridge for 50 years. And this is a long enough time to make its origin now seem largely a matter of historical interest, or perhaps less ambitiously, or antiquarian curiosity for those who have that kind of curiosity. Nothing objectionable with the former, and nothing too reprehensible either, I hope, with the latter. But what I've discovered is that an exercise in microhistory, the topic has made it rather unviable by a serious lack of documentary evidence. Because starting from 1970, and with increasing frequency in 71 and 72, the minutes of the meeting of the faculty board, which are preserved in the faculty, contain a number of tantalizing references to reports from the faculty planning committee, and then from a newly created management committee for beginners Greek, but nothing is recorded in the minutes other than the reports have been received and, when relevant, approved. The documents themselves are not preserved, the substantial documents are not preserved in the Faculty of Classics or in the Faculty of Classics section in the University Archive. So one might speculate that the relocation of the faculty to its present building in 1982 may have had an adverse effect on its archival holding. And one might hope that perhaps the private files of some former faculty members might still contain some of these documents. And my next step would be to try and find out if this is the case. But for the time being, I've not been able to find any significant document that deals with the creation of the intensive Greek course. So I'll tell you what I have found in the minutes. One would expect a matter of such importance to have been discussed informally for some time, but the first evidence I've been able to locate in the minutes is that of a special meeting of the faculty board on the 23rd of April 1970, in which a recommendation of the planning committee was accept, I quote, "The classical tripos be revised to make it suitable for entrance with," I quote, "much less knowledge of Greek." Further decisions were deferred to a later date. The wording "much less knowledge of Greek" seems to be potentially significant, both for its vagueness, but also and especially for stopping short of introducing the word beginners. And does the decision to defer indicate the discussion was still ongoing? If so, things must have moved rather quickly, because on 9th of May 1970, another special meeting of the faculty board was held, at which, I quote, "The report of the Committee for Beginners Greek was considered, and it was agreed to establish forthwith a management, bracket, not teaching, notice, Committee for Beginners Greek." And the members of the committee are listed, and the minutes conclude with an auspice that, as my colleague would recognize, read as rather uncannily prescient. It was thought desirable that participation in any teaching course of Greek for beginners should be widely distributed among the teaching officers of the faculty. Now, minutes of the faculty board were taken to record decision or wishes and not discussion. So one is inevitably left searching for clues, and there is a real risk of overinterpreting. But it is noticeable, at least, that entrance with much less knowledge should be changing to beginners within the space of 2 weeks. The matter was evidently still regarded as in need of discussion, because yet another special meeting of the board was held at the beginning of the next academic year on 8th October 1970. And that the minutes simply record that a draft report for the institution of a beginner's Greek course be sent to the liaison committee for their comments and then submitted to the faculty board at the annual meeting of November 19. And here again, the matter was regarded as sufficiently momentous to require formal approval by the faculty. It's interesting, but here again, we don't know how the faculty board received it. It must have approved it, because on the 20th of May, we find the, as it were, institutive moment. The minute says, "It was agreed that the managing committee for intensive Greek be asked to consider means to making known to prospective candidates," etc. Even though we don't know how and why, what we do learn from such a scanty minutes is that at some point between October and May, the course acquired its name, Intensive Greek, that has kept ever since. And the choice of name was and remains significant, because it points to an approach that has now lasted for serious reason for half a century. Because the idea behind the name, one I would argue, is that if Greek has not been studied before university, it will be studied at university at such a pace as to make it possible for those who take the course in the first year to continue studying for the classic stripers, for a classic stripers that presupposes the advanced knowledge of the language. And it is remarkable, therefore, that nowhere in the minutes a reference should have been made to the most important practical consequences of that intensive approach, and a feature that has defined our working ever since. That is the requirement that those who apply for the course commit themselves to learn a significant amount of Greek before they start the course. And this remains a formal condition that colleges impose when offering a place. And this is where the prospectus that you have in front of you comes in, because you will find a specific description of what the people who wanted to start the intensive Greek in 1972 for the first time were required to do. They were required to attend a summer school, and Paul will tell us a bit more in a moment. So 50 years may have proven, at least for the time being, a little bit too many for documentary history, but not so for oral history. And Dr. Millet, who took the intensive Greek course in 73-74, in the second year of his existence, became a Greek historian, and after a few years at the University of Leicester, came back to Cambridge to take up a post in the Faculty of Classics, for which he has only very recently retired. In fact, we celebrated Paul's contribution to Greek history in Cambridge with a conference in his honor last year. But today he has kindly agreed to be interviewed to provide, as it were, the information that the document don't provide about the course. So my first question will be, how did you decide to embark on the task of learning Greek at university?
Two things first, if I may.
Yes.
You talked about those involved in setting up the intensive Greek course. One person I know involved in it who's still very much around is Pat Easterling.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked with her a bit about it. And one thing she did tell me, if I remember correctly, is that one difficulty was that Professor Page, Dennis Page, the Regius Professor of Greek, was not in favor of intensive Greek.
Yes.
So it wasn't possible to go ahead until he retired, I think in 1973. The other thing, I'm about to say, the second thing is that oral history is notoriously inaccurate,
yes,
and misleading. And I may have got that wrong. If I have, I apologize to the shades of Professor Page. But just to illustrate how things can go awry in one's memory, a few months ago, I gave an interview with Mary Beard, talking about times in the faculty. And I told her with great confidence that there were 4 people in my cohort doing intensive Greek. As I was told afterwards, there were in fact 11. It's only run by a factor of 3 or so, yes. So what I say from now on is not on oath, right? Okay. But to answer your question, I began by reading Part 1 Economics, a 1-year course. And I found out in the course of that year that there was a change to the tripos here. So it would be possible for me to do classics without any Greek whatsoever, learning from scratch. I realized I'd have to choose, I'd have to take that moment to make that choice, because I'd never be able to do it again. But I would emphasize it was not being repelled by economics, it was by being attracted by classics. And I have, after all, ended up as an ancient economic historian. Right, yes. So it's all come right in the end. And I think the reason, or one reason, that Moses Finlay, the professor of ancient history, was prepared to take me on as his pupil was because of that rather unusual route I'd taken into classics.
And can you tell us a bit about the way in which the course was organized?
Yeah, well, I entered in the Michaelmas of 1973. As I said, there were 10 or 11 of us. We were divided up into 2 groups for the pre-term course, a week, and maybe more than a week actually, if not 10 days, a pre-term course. There was a sort of more advanced group, and they were all people with O-level and A-level Greek. Yes. Some had done a quick A-level, which I thought was a bit of a cheat.
So corresponding to GCSE,
yeah,
roughly.
Yeah, indeed. And there was 2 of us in the other group who had no Greek whatsoever. And the other person in the group with me was John Wilkins, who became professor of Greek at Exeter, as I recall. The only Greek that we had were 2 weeks at the summer school, then held at Dean Close School in Cheltenham. Pretty Spartan place, and I must say. That has now become Bryanston Summer School, of course.
Organized by the Joint Association of Classical
Indeed,
Teachers.
yes, yeah.
To come to the nitty-gritty, what books did you read?
You mean in terms of the teaching?
That's right, what level?
Yeah. Okay, well, as I remember, the grammar book was provided by the faculty, but it was pretty primitive in that it wasn't even photocopied. It was roneoed, duplicated. I suppose with the problem of writing, of typing in Greek in those days, it was inscribed like wax tablets on a sort of a wax-covered skin, which was then printed off. Yes, in fact, the first page had the Greek alphabet, and they'd missed out the letter tau, yes. Which had to be written in by hand. Now, so Franco, I must have that grammar somewhere, and I'll give it to you. In fact, I must confess I used the grammar at the back of a school textbook called Thrasymachus.
It might be worth mentioning that the course that we now use, which is the Joint Association of Classical Course, Classical Teachers course, that work for it started in Cambridge, in News Hall, 2 years later, the beginning, in 1974. So it was not even yet in preparation. Yeah. And it's possible that actually one of the reasons why work started is in some sort of connection with a new course. So at what stage do you begin to read straightforward, real Greek, as it were, non-grammar?
Yeah, not made up Greek. Well, it was in that pre-term course with Sophocles Philoctetes, which I found totally incomprehensible with just 2 weeks of Greek behind me, my totally inadequate syntax, grammar, and vocabulary. But fortunately, taking the small class I was in with John Wilkins was Dr. John Killen, who was kindness itself, I must say, in helping me out and finding the odd half sentence I could translate from the text. And without his encouragement, I would have packed it in. Mm-hmm. So, as often I think, a really sympathetic and helpful teacher makes all the difference. The daily grammar and syntax classes, we were all together, all 10 or 11 of us for those, and they were based on materials in the Philoctetes, which was sensible, I guess, but rather over-focused. We had one session entirely on Greek particles in the Philoctetes, with a special emphasis on the epixagetic ge, which has stayed with me forever, but maybe not much else from those classes. Yeah.
Was it so that the course was effectively exclusively language and reading of text? Was there any other component?
No, indeed. As I think it says in the handout you showed there.
Yeah.
In the evening, there were a number of talks by members of the faculty, which I do know some of those. Frank Stubbings gave a brilliant talk about the serpent column, the Greek monument for victory over the Persians. Renford Bamborough, the philosopher from St. John's, gave a talk, and a member of the teaching team described him to me beforehand as the second cleverest man in England. Now, I wish I'd asked who the cleverest was, but I didn't. Also, that man in England, not person, not Britain, but England. I regret I cannot understand. I can't recall what he said. Though I do remember my colleague Alan Crease from Queen's being brave enough to ask a question, which I certainly didn't do.
So this was the initial week or 10 days.
Yeah.
And then term started.
Yes.
So what would happen during term then?
Okay, well then we had our regular reading classes, 2 per week, I think it was, looking at sort of set texts, all 11 of us together. First one with Miss Duke, looking at a speech by Demosthenes against Callicles, which after Philoctetes seemed actually doable in terms of the Greek. And that speech, it was a dispute between neighbors in the country over damage to property, was one which I used quite a lot in my own work later on, in fact, work on neighbors in the ancient Greek world.
And you were asked to translate from the text, from just a straight text in class with.
Yeah, that's right. And also there was, the later much missed John Easterling did Plato's Apology with us. And again, that's a text which I've used a lot in my work ever since. And also Roger Dorr, rather astringent on the Alcestis. But again, later I realized how important that play was in terms of reciprocity in interpersonal relations. So there's certainly been payoffs from the detailed study of these texts later on.
But if I understand from looking at the program as printed, it doesn't look as if there was any other formal teaching other than these reading classes? Did you get any help with the grammar beyond the initial week?
Not from the faculty. And I think in a sense, you know, Franco, we helped each other. I mean, that I would spend, you know, a lot of time talking with John Wilkins and going through the texts with him. You know, I think that as a result of how can I put it? Yeah, I think that there was a problem in that there was so much other classics I wanted to do. History, philosophy, literature, Greek and Latin. I did not have enough time to consolidate my Greek to the extent I'd have liked to. And I think I am still learning Greek. But then does anyone ever say, I have now learned Greek? I think probably not. I think also it's helped, it helped when I started leading the reading classes later on when I came back to Cambridge and taking intensive Greek reading classes, because I was aware how it was possible to work really quite hard, but still have extensive gaps in your knowledge. Yeah.
So you would take turn to translate, but translate and then what? Did you do anything else with the text? Did you discuss them?
No, there wasn't much time. There was not time for much else.
Okay.
And I think John Easterling may even have laid on an extra class a week to get through the whole of Plato, Plato's Apology. I do recall who was it? Roger Dorr. I think I described his classes as somewhat astringent. We were doing Alcestis with him, and by using every device possible in terms of dictionaries, commentaries, translations, cribs, I could just about make some sort of sense of the text. And so we started off the first session and he dropped on me to translate, which I tried to. He said, no, don't look at the text is corrupt. Translate what's in the apparatus at the bottom of the page, which I thought was deeply unfair.
Rather, yes.
But at least it made me realize that, you know, other readings were possible.
And what about college supervisions?
Yes, now this was very important. I was very fortunate in having an hour a week with Mrs. Eleanor Scott, who was a retired school teacher. And she was excellent in that she understood the problems of teaching people Greek from scratch. Right. And of course, colleagues in the faculty, with the best will in the world, were not used to teaching beginners Greek. And so they were, in a sense, learning on the job.
And so you were just one-to-one with her?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
They're asking about exams. I don't mean your marks. I mean the nature of the exams. What were you asked to do in the exams?
Well, of course, it was the same as for the other prelim Part 1A people. But we had a different Greek paper. And as I recall, it was simply translation of passages from those scene texts. So
no unprepared translation.
Well, having said that, it almost happened in that I sat down in the exam room for the translation paper, the scene paper, and to my horror, I could make nothing of the Homer Odyssey paper. I thought, what's going on here? And a hand went up and someone said, you've set the wrong passage, you've set the wrong book of Homer. So some poor chastened examiner was sent off to photocopy the right book, fortunately.
Well, this is a case in which oral history is actually supported by documents because one set of documents which are still in the faculty is a full set of examination paper. And it is indeed the case that for that year, the printed version is replaced by, as well, an inserted page with someone actually writing up the rubric, as it were, on the spot, they would see. Can I ask you about the relationship between that relatively, at the time, small group of people learning Greek as beginners and the rest of the undergraduates, the rest of the cohort?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there was a sense that we felt we were kind of very minor pioneers in taking on this new, very new course. In a way, I think is the same, perhaps still the same with people doing the four-year course, you know, doing something which is really rather different. The downside was what I hinted at before, is that the teaching had not been very fully developed, nowhere near as professional as it is now in terms of assessment and support classes and so on. But yeah, there was a sense, I think, of doing something which was a bit different. I just say when I came back in 1983 to the faculty, I was glad to propose that there be abolished the practice of putting on the class list an asterisk next to the names of those who've done intensive Greek. They should not be sort of stigmatized in that kind of way. But in fact, there were almost more people with an asterisk than without. But by the time that was cancelled, yeah.
To confirm this and to say something about the now and then, in June 22, the last time in which beginners Greek was examined, there were 81 candidates as a total for Greek language and text, and of these, 59 attended the intensive Greek course, and it's only a minority, a third, who did not actually learn Greek at university. And I'm sure that you'll be pleased to hear that the first 6 highest results were all achieved by people who did the intensive Greek course. And on this very uplifting note, I will pass on to my colleague.
Could I say one more thing?
Of course.
Just one more thing. I feel I didn't really explain properly why I went back to classics. But let me say just one sentence about that. My own teacher, I mentioned Mrs. Finlay, always said, classics is not a subject, meaning it is not itself a coherent discipline. If so, what is it? Well, I will tell you, classics is a disease, a benign disease, but once you've caught it, you've got it forever, and there's no cure. Right.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to move on to talking mostly about the 4-year degree, which is an area of the classics tripos that I'm particularly involved with. That's me teaching a very tall person. And like Franco, we're key people in the faculty for teaching language, for running the language courses, and for teaching the classes that are associated with that. Like Franco, I'm also at one of the colleges where I have a teaching but also a pastoral role, which is in some ways not particularly relevant to my role in the faculty, but ends up having certain crossover elements. So I'm going to take you back a little bit, fast forwarding a little bit from the time that Franco and Paul are talking about, but to the late 80s. And a key moment for thinking about the 4-year degree is actually the Education Act in 1988, at which point the national curriculum came in. And crucially, for people who are engaged in the study of the classical world, the national curriculum did not include classical subjects in it. And that was a very big moment for the strength and health of the discipline in this country. In particular, it meant that the role of classical subjects within the state sector became problematic and under real threat. Schools no longer got kind of brownie points for providing it as part of their curriculum. It was easy for it to drop out of the core curriculum that state schools needed to provide. So that was a kind of very problematic moment for classics remaining in schools, particularly within the state sector. And of course, this was at a time when university as a whole, but certainly Oxbridge in particular, were thinking more about their relationship with schools, thinking more about their relationship to the state sector and the private sector. And that's always been a topic that classics has had to think hard and carefully about. So that was a kind of one of the key moments. Another is TQA. TQA stands for Teaching Quality Assessment, and is sometime in the late 90s. I haven't done my archival research, I'm afraid, sometime in the late 90s. The classics faculty was assessed for its teaching quality, and we were told we were very good boys and girls and we were doing an excellent job, but that as a faculty we were very much dogged by the fact that we could accept so few people from the state sector because students had to have studied at the very least, Latin to A level to be able to apply to Cambridge to do classics. And it was at that point that the faculty jumped on the idea of, okay, we see that problem, we feel that problem, we want to do something about it. And so we proposed to the university a from scratch classics degree. And the university responded very positively to that. And we discussed and set up the 4-year degree. As the name suggests, and as James alluded to earlier on, the 4-year degree is kind of an extra year. It's kind of a year bolted on the front. And there are ways in which that has felt a bit sort of clunky, a bit, well, we cleverly stuck an extra year there and people did Latin. On one level, it's, it's not the most sophisticated pattern, but it has also been one of the great strengths of our 4-year degree. The students do that extra year, but then they're in the same cohort as everybody else. It's not been a separate route through the classics tripos. It's been this pre-year, and then students on the 4-year degree are every bit as much full classicists doing the full range of subjects. And that's kind of what I mean by access to the full swathe of classical disciplines. We were very clear that we didn't want the 4-year degree to be only takeable by people who had some sort of bizarre enthusiasm and bizarre skill at languages. We wanted people to be able to take the 4-year degree who were good enough linguists at the classical languages, but who were doing classics, had caught the disease of classics, as Paul called it, for all the range of what classics gives access to. People who wanted to be ancient historians and knew that being able to translate Latin and Greek was a part of that. People who were very keen literature students and wanted to study the ancient texts. So people who wanted to be classicists with all the full range of what that means and were prepared to graft at the languages to be able to do that. We wanted it not just to be people who were specific linguistic experts. So kind of access for the rounded classicist. And it was a tough call. It is a tough call to learn 2 ancient, highly inflected languages, 2 languages which are only represented by high-end elite texts from scratch. It's a tough call, but it works. Oh, that's a picture of me again with one of our former students. So we've had, since the inauguration of the 4-year degree, we have had many cohorts through, 20 cohorts through. I've got a slide in a minute that shows how the course has grown. And our 4-year degree classicists have gone on to do the whole range of things which classics graduates very often go on to do. So the obvious things, classics teachers, but also sometimes other subjects, actors, lawyers, civil servants, academics, running own businesses. This is an interesting one. I have 2 ex-students from the 4-year degree who are doctors, who decided after their classics degree to do graduate medicine and are now working as doctors in the NHS. And both of these people, I'm actually still in touch with both of them, are very clear that actually classics was one of the things that made them feel able to make that switch. It was the sense that having taken on and mastered from scratch huge bodies of material that they had to start from the beginning with, i.e. Latin and Greek, that gave them the confidence to think that they could of course do that again in terms of turning towards a medical career. Also, of course, writers and journalists. In a little bit of research I was doing, I did find that one of my ex-4-year degree students is somebody who's a journalist with one of the national papers and who indeed was the person who scooped the story that led to various political scandals this year. I'll be discreet and not mention more than that. So the 4-year degree, past, present and future. Here are some stats. It's been growing. In the early 2000s, we mostly had 10 to 12 students studying the 4-year course. I think there was one particularly small year where we maybe only had 6, but it gradually increased over the course of the early years, growing sometimes into the low teens, growing into the higher teens. Even as recently as 2016 to 17, we had a cohort of only 10. I have to say that was unusual then. I think we were mostly closer to upper teens by that point. In 2017 to 18, we had 12. In 18 to 19, 21. In 2019 to 20, these are the years that they arrived, we had 30. And in 2021, again, 30, 2021 to 2, 28. But then for this coming year, we have had another of our quite big jumps and indeed have 41 students who will be about to return to start their course in a few days' time. Now, I use the word return because they have already been here for 2 weeks. The four-year degree students come at the beginning of September for a 2-week intensive language course in Latin. They come for these 2 weeks. They're housed in a college, not the college that they're going to be at. They're housed all together, do 2 weeks of Latin, go away for 2 or 3 weeks, and then come back. And that's another great strength, I think, of the four-year degree. Those students have bonded, they've met each other, they've had a bit of a go at what being in Cambridge is like. They've got to know their way around, they've got to meet some of their teachers, and then they can go away and then come back for the mayhem and excitement of Freshers' Week and the beginning of term. Importantly, for this coming year, just as Franco was talking about how the proportion of intensive Greek students versus post-A-level students has grown and grown and grown. Importantly, for this year, for the first time, our four-year cohort is pushing 45% of our total cohort. So there's been a real shift and balance in the proportions between the different cohorts, particularly in recent years. So how do we do it? Well, our groups aren't as small as they were in Paul's day with his 2 people in his class. We mostly teach groups of 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10. They have an intensive set of classes. Students will have at least 4, if for some terms 5 classes. That's sort of roughly 1 a day in their first year, as well as lectures, as well as their supervisions that are put on for them by the colleges. We teach them intensively. I'll come on in a moment to talk about how we read texts. We get them reading texts from as soon as we feasibly can. Not quite philoctetes within 2 weeks of starting Greek, but certainly within a month or so of starting Latin from scratch, students will be attempting real unadapted Latin with a lot of hand-holding, usually only pedagogical hand-holding, actual hand-holding if necessary. We try to make the experience of starting on real Latin texts fun, manageable, at times scarily challenging, but something that feels doable. And that's something that's very important to the way that we try to present it. Importantly, we're going to try and read texts in a very multi-layered way. And that was something that kind of was alluded to in terms of the Greek classes as well. So here is a little bit of Latin text that I will be reading with students in a few weeks' time. Bella terra et mari civilia externaque toto in orbe terrarum saepe gessi. Victorque omnibus veniam petentibus civibus peperci. I won't read anymore. You probably don't want to listen to me reading Latin. And I'll just pause momentarily. I don't know how well you can see it, but I don't know if you can see the background, as well as that lovely inscription there. The background, can anybody work out what the background is? The Zoom, actually, but you're on the right lines, exactly. So it's actually a Zoom class that I gave. I'm up in the corner there, looking a bit worried, I think, but the others are all smiling. As a kind of remembrance of how, you know, of course, in the pandemic, all of this went on and it went on by Zoom. And that close and detailed reading of texts, that intensity of the program that we're offering, was something that was incredibly valuable during the pandemic. So many students told me how important it was to them to have these small group things that kept happening, that had to happen nearly every day, that gave them kind of structure and a sense of continuity and a sense that somebody was noticing how their academic work was going during those very difficult days of the pandemic. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. Okay, so one of the ways in which we read is to parse verbs. So I will often have my students, and I know it's sort of, it's not glamorous, but they'll be picking out and parsing, i.e. telling me the grammatical information about the verbs in a passage. So that might be the first thing that I get my students to do. If anybody wants to tell me what the color coding is, they can do that later. There is a subtle color coding in the way that I have marked out those verbs. So what I'm trying to get at is that on one level, we're reading for the real nitty-gritty of learning the language. We're reading for things that say, we need to be able to spot that Gessi is the first person and means I waged. Doesn't mean you waged, it means I waged. So on one level, we're reading for that absolutely basic understanding the language stuff. But we're also reading for a whole hell of a lot of other reasons. Same little passage. We're reading to think about Augustus's campaigns, what that might tell us about Roman military practice. We're reading to think about Augustan propaganda. He talks about waging war. He stuck in that Coelia there, civil war. He stuck that in and maybe doesn't want us to notice that. He wants us to think about the externa bella, the great and glorious campaigns he waged outside. So we might be thinking about Augustan propaganda. We might even be thinking about empire and its legacy. We might be thinking about Latin style. This is the res gestae. It's not the most exciting Latin, but it's good, relatively elegant Latin. That's not even getting into the issue of the fact that there's a parallel Greek text, and that's a really fascinating thing about the res gestae, that we have a version in Latin and a version in Greek. We might be reading it to think about it as a monument. It was an inscription, and as a physical object. Now, while much of the class that I'm teaching will be focused on the linguistic elements, all of these kind of things are there in the background. They might come in at any moment. And that might be something that I bring in, but it also might be something that the students might ask about. So it's a very multi-layered approach, which reflects the fact that I want and expect my students to have a multi-layered interest in what they're reading. Yes, I want them to learn the basics of grammar, but I also want to know that I'm getting them to read it for a whole host of reasons. And the questions that they want to ask about the text are really important ones too. So what do we do for the 4-year degree? Latin in a year, Greek after Christmas. It's quite a busy time. We have the September course, which I've referred to. We do quite a lot of reading practice. So we do start with some course book material to try and build up some basic reading skills. But then we'll start, this is a slight change, we're slightly changing the syllabus this term. We'll start reading Augustus' Res Gestae, certainly by halfway through this coming term, probably a little bit sooner than that with some of the groups. After Christmas, we'll read a book of Ovid's Metamorphoses. So complex Latin poetry for students who've been doing Latin for about 4 months, but it works. I mean, partly because Ovid is so kind of mad and fun and kind of crazy. He really draws them in. And then we'll read some Catullus in the final term. They start Greek after Christmas, just with course book, of in fact reading Greek that Franco alluded to as being begun quite soon after the inception of the intensive Greek course. They'll start with that after Christmas. So, what about the future? Because I think we have a strong sense, and I think Paul put his finger on this, that doing the 4-year course is a big undertaking. It's a critical and exciting undertaking, and it's still quite groundbreaking. To start from absolute scratch with those languages and get to the same level, and often indeed beyond. Some of our best students who get the best marks are ones who've started from scratch. So groundbreaking, but also we want it to be somewhere that's going in a process. We're expecting the 4-year degree to become, heading to be 50-50, maybe before too long, expecting to have more of our students doing the 4-year course than the 3-year course, particularly depending on the picture of classics in schools. The change from having 4 AS subjects and then people choose 3A levels has been another difficult moment for classics. The possibility of a 4th subject when people might have taken Latin or might have taken Greek or might have tried Class Civ has been another moment where classics in state schools is under great threat. The number of schools where people can study Latin, particularly up to A level within the state sector, has just taken another, perhaps not nosedive, but another worrying downward turn. So we do have to think about the future. We do have to think about how we can make classical subjects thrive within our educational world and how we can make Cambridge part of that. How big can the 4-year degree grow? Well, we would like to feel that it can grow as big as it needs to grow. But of course, there are some complicated issues associated with that. Money. Students who do the 4-year degree end up with 33% more debt than students who don't. So the students who choose to take on something like the 4-year degree are having to kind of invest in that in a very, very real way. And that's, that's tough. There's also resourcing implications for us as a faculty. We've talked about intensity, we've talked about the personal touch and how we engage with students very, very individually. But that means small groups, lots of teaching, it costs money. These are things that we have to think about. And time. I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet that learning classical languages from scratch has a very particular relationship with time and people's time. It's a time-consuming investment, both our teaching, but also the time it takes for students to get to the level of competence that they want to and that we want them to get to. People have to make a commitment to working in a different way, in many ways, to how they might work in other aspects of their degree. There's a kind of gritty consistency and regularity of work needed to become proficient in the languages. So it makes different demands on people's time and students' time. We also have to think about the cultural capital that's required to choose to do a subject like classics. We know, because we're long-term sufferers with the disease of classics, we know that doing classics is a fantastic degree. It leads on to all sorts of amazing possibilities. That's kind of because we know that studying the Latin, the ancient Greek, the ancient Roman and Greek world, studying the languages, will be looked at very positively by future employers, that it carries a degree of cultural capital along with it that means that it's a worthwhile investment of people's time and effort. We need to keep getting that message out to as wide a section of the UK population as we can, because that really matters. And classics' place in the world is of course changing all the time. Has some difficult moments, has some really positive moments. And again, that's something that the classic as a discipline has to keep thinking about to ensure that it remains relevant, to ensure that it's something that new students want to come into, the disease that people want to catch. But it's absolutely worth it. These are some quotes from students talking about what they've gained. Oh, I've just spotted a typo in in my typing up, but never mind. Ignore the learning, please. That should be learning. Students talking about what studying classics on the 4-year degree has meant to them. And I think one of the things that strikes me always about these quotes, but also about others that I've had from other students, is how much it's something that they personally chose and they feel personally invested in, that they got a huge amount out of in all sorts of ways. Academically, in terms of their sense of their future success, but also in terms of the friendships that they've gained, both amongst themselves, but also people who are still very much in contact with teaching members of the faculty, and still feel that there's that kind of lifelong connection that has come through this very engaged and tough, but very fulfilling process of learning the languages from scratch. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have 10 minutes or so remaining in our slot. If anyone had any questions to Rosanna, Franco, or Paul. Yes. Oh, yes, yes, because there are people listening online. So if you don't mind waiting for the microphone.
Are other universities in the world adopting a similar approach?
Well, in a sense, we could very proudly say no, not quite, in that, I mean, our obvious colleagues and perhaps competitors, as to put it like that, in Oxford, well, for a start, Oxford's always had a 4-year course in classics. And so when they introduced the possibility, which also exists in Oxford, of learning Latin and Greek from scratch, they thought that you can't really learn both languages to the same standards within what was that, as it were, 4-year course as well. There was no, from their point of view, there was no possibility of adding a 5th year. And so they thought that you have to choose. So you can either do a Greek course and then do a bit of Latin in the second half, or vice versa. So from that point of view, the idea of learning both languages in 4 years, and by the end, reaching the same standards of those who started the course with A level, no, as far as I know, not in this country.
I think from Franco's description of the inauguration of the intensive course 50 years ago, I think the faculty then took a very wise decision not to offer a different degree. It's the same degree. So all of our students come out with one and the same classics degree, whether it's taken you 3 years or 4, whether you've studied Greek intensively, having had Latin before, or no. So you don't apply to do classical civ or Latin or Greek or classics. Everyone's doing classics. People are coming from different entry points, but the very important point is they all converge as soon as we possibly can manage to doing classics together, certainly by the final year of their degree. And that's something I think the faculty's really proud of. It does cause difficulties because it does mean with all of these different entry points, you're having to sort of manage a whole range of prior knowledge and levels of prior knowledge, and trying to sort of make it all work. But I think that's absolutely the right thing for us to do.
Hi. So it's interesting that the 4-year course, I guess, is an enabler to allow people to come to the course who haven't had access to certainly Greek beforehand. I mean, in terms of, and you talked about the sort of cultural capital, what's the sort of faculty doing about people who don't have that cultural capital and you know, may not be aware of a sort of classics course and bringing those?
Well, we try to do a lot of outreach work, and actually have a long-standing tradition of doing that, possibly more so than many other faculties, because classics has been sort of under threat in various ways for 50 plus years. We actually have been, it's part of our DNA to do the going out to schools talks, to putting on events. The faculty at the moment is partnered with an organisation called Classics for All, and we're running a Greek academy, which is mostly online and is teaching Greek at a fairly beginner level, but Greek to local state school students. We run a program where our students go out to teach in primary schools, doing a bit of a kind of introduction to Latin. So many of my colleagues go out and do schools talks and big events. I mean, everyone's heard of Mary Beard, of course. You know, so again, it's in our DNA that we go out and try to spread the word.
I think part of it, I think the Greek and Roman world is fascinating and always has remained so. And it still is sort of, people are aware of it, and it does get embedded at various points in key stages as students go through the school. But our job is to make clear that it's available as a subject for university level study for everybody. That's keeping whatever enthusiasm there was for the Greeks and Romans early on, and making it clear to everyone that that's something that they can, with the grit that I think Rosanna was talking about, and with all the help we can offer them, that's something that they can do at university, indeed here in Cambridge.
Thank you. Bearing in mind how saltatory learning is, often having a level of learning and then having time to let it settle before you go on to the next level. You spoke about convergence. Have you noticed with your experience as these pupils have gone through that there's any divergence later on in what they choose to do, or indeed their outcomes and success in classics?
Shall I answer?
Yeah.
I think parts of the tripos where there's the sort of toughest linguistic tests, I think it would be true to say that there are points at which certain cohorts within the from scratch lot don't perform on average quite as well as the others. Within that cohort, the kind of what we might think as the most linguistically able, the ones who are very very enthusiastic recipients of linguistic teaching, actually often go on to do significantly better even in those narrowly linguistic tasks than the people who've come with A level. There is, however, I would say roughly a kind of quarter of the cohort who'll do okay in those, but it's never going to play to their strengths. However, in our final year, the picture very much evens up, and it's our final year that is their degree classification. And it's not the case that from scratch students are not choosing to do literature options. They're choosing to do literature options pretty much equally with other students. So it kind of comes out in the wash. Basically, that's a bit of a sort of vague answer.
I think there was one more question here.
Yes.
So obviously you've mentioned the kind of 4-year degree as opposed to the 3-year degree, and the different kind of ways that people come into the degree, but they all come out with the same kind of classics degree at the end. What is the relationship between the kind of group that does Latin and Greek from scratch, the group that does Greek from scratch, and the group that don't do anything from scratch? Are they all quite separate, or is everyone together, but then some people go off and do some extra stuff? Or?
Sort of all of the above. So the people who are doing the 4-year degree, they will do their Latin classes in their first year, and a variety of other things, lectures and all of that kind of stuff. They start a bit of Greek. And then as they move into their second year, they will be in intensive Greek classes with students who are coming in, having done Latin A level and starting Greek from scratch or from medium scratch or whatever. So they'll be absolutely in the same classes with them. In fact, one of the jobs I've been doing this last week is making up those groups, and they're roughly half ex-4-year degree students and roughly half new people coming in from outside, which again, I think is a really nice strength, that those new students are in classes with people who've been there for a year and who kind of know what they're doing.
And perhaps it's worth pointing out that this difference in any case only applies to that part of the teaching which focuses directly on the language. It's not as if we have separate, say, history lectures or philosophy lecture or linguistic lectures for people who know Latin, or depending on how much Latin or Greek they know. So there is a lot that goes on in the faculty, in the way of teaching, that unites everyone.
Absolutely.
In fact, the majority of what we do actually has everybody in the same room as well.
Yeah, and I think the removal of that star on the list I think is a really important marker of that. It's not a badge you carry with you. I mean, it's something that is just part of what you are as we go through the degree together. I think we're beginning to come to the end of time, so I'd like to thank Rosanna, Franco, and Paul. If you would like to know any more about the classics courses we offer, please look at our website, where you'll get some more information about the 4-year and the 3-year versions and how we see that working. And we're very grateful for all of your support. So thank you very much.
Thank you.